And last week we learned that in Jesus' arrest and interrogation by Annas, the Jewish rulers violated practically every rule in the Judean justice system laid down in the Talmud. Jesus was arrested without a warrant. There was no charge against him. He wasn't allowed the opportunity to have an advocate. He was invited to incriminate himself, and he was physically assaulted by an officer while in custody. In England and Wales, these rights are under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. In the United States, you'll hear them referred to as Miranda rights under the Fifth Amendment, but they were very similar in Judea at the time. Even worse, Jesus was arrested at night. No witnesses for the prosecution were brought to the court, nor was Jesus offered the opportunity to call witnesses in his defence. And this was a private interrogation, all of which the Talmud forbids. You'd have thought, wouldn't you, that the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, would have run this whole process strictly by the book, so that no one could reasonably object to what they were doing, or with the verdict that they hoped to achieve. That justice would be done and be seen to be done flawlessly. But all of this would presuppose that the ruling class had a solid legal case against Jesus. They didn't. All they had was a murderous intent. Their paramount self-interest. Jesus had to die as soon as possible, by any means possible. And remember that whenever John refers to the Jews, he always means the religious leaders, the ruling class. He is not referring to Jews in general. And unfortunately, Christ's crucifixion has been blamed on the Jewish people for 2,000 years, with terrible and genocidal consequences. It's fueled violence and discrimination against Jews around the world, and it still thrives today. Anti-Semitism has no basis in Scripture. Anti-Semitism is racism, pure and simple, and it must play no part in the Christian life. When Jesus was brought in chains for questioning by Annas, Jesus exposed the religious establishment's wanton disregard for the law, and that's perhaps why Annas terminated the session without saying another word and sent Jesus to his son-in-law Caiaphas. So let's read John's wonderful account of what happened next. So we're on chapter 18, and I'm starting to read at verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die." Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They all cried again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So, John doesn't tell us at all about what happened with the meeting with Caiaphas, but Luke does, and it serves as a background to Pilate's question. So on the back of the sheet you've got, I've just got the passage from Luke chapter 22, which I'll just read. "As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, 'If you are the Christ, tell us.' But he said to them," Jesus, "If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter, the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God." Then they all said, "Are you then the Son of God?" So he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." So, although this time the session is held in daylight, Caiaphas still did not tell Jesus what the charge was against him. Caiaphas made the suspect incriminate himself, and he called no witnesses before sending him on to Pilate. So, actually in verse 28, having comprehensively trampled on their own system of justice in order to pursue the extrajudicial killing of Jesus, John tells us that the chief priests would not enter the Roman fortress where Pilate lived, lest they should be defiled. And I can't help thinking that in that verse 28, John is pointing out a very deep irony that these murderous people should be worried about entering a Roman fortress and becoming defiled. Not much is known about Pilate before he became governor of Judea in AD 26. Some people say that he was from the south of Italy, and some say he married a granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus, which did wonders for his military career, I'm sure. And historians at the time all record Pilate as a brutal, ruthless man who was eventually removed from his post in AD 36 because he led a particularly barbaric and bloody attack, even by Roman standards, on a Samaritan armed group on their holy mountain of Mount Gerizim. Pilate was recalled to Rome and seems to have simply retired. However, because of his reluctance to condemn Jesus, Pilate is actually revered as a martyr and a saint in the Ethiopian and Coptic Christian church. So Pilate had a well-earned reputation for the indiscriminate killing of innocent people, and that's a character trait which the chief priests hoped to capitalise on in the case of Jesus. But even if Jesus wasn't a Roman citizen, Pilate knows his Roman law. He wants to know the charge. What accusation do you bring against this man? And the chief priests standing outside the praetorium don't answer. They don't have an answer. So they say, well, if he weren't an evildoer, then we wouldn't have delivered him up to you. Well, I'm sorry, but that's a pathetically circular argument. Basically, Pilate is saying, have you gone through a proper judicial process? Not really. But he's definitely a villain, so why don't you just kill him? Is the answer. They just want Pilate to pass sentence and not ask any knotty questions about why they want him dead. Pilate mustn't concern himself with the Jewish judicial process, which the chief priests had so comprehensively ripped up. So unimpressed with their evasion, Pilate wants to throw Jesus back to the chief priests. This is really beneath his pay grade. As Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. And the chief priest said, no, we don't want to do that, because we don't actually have any witnesses. So they throw the focus straight back to the sentence, not the judicial process. It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. So they're saying, come on, Pilate, what do you care? What do you care if he's innocent or guilty? Just get this done for us, so that actually we can blame you, if necessary, to protect our own skins if everything goes pear-shaped. After all, it was your soldiers that arrested Jesus in the first place. So although Pilate is not convinced by their argument, nor does he want to be played by the chief priests, so he calls Jesus into the praetorium. Are you king of the Jews? He says. Now, this question is understood when we look at Luke. Luke's account in chapter 23 says this: Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And that's why Pilate says, Are you king of the Jews? So here we see the false witnesses the chief priests needed to present Jesus as a threat to Rome, rather than simply some irritating Galilean ruffian. Although none of the multitude seemed to have wanted to come forward and commit perjury. The punishment for perjury was death. Pilate wasn't at all convinced that the man before him was a dangerous terrorist leader. Are you king of the Jews? You can almost hear the mocking disdain in his voice. You? Are you a king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? Jesus wants to know whether this was a Roman question or a Jewish question. Even though, of course, Jesus knew how Pilate was going to answer. Pilate is simply not interested in the parochial affairs of the Jews, so long as they don't pose a threat to the empire he serves. Pilate's response to Jesus says it all, with the rhetorical question, am I a Jew? Of course he's not. He says, of course, I'm asking on behalf of the Roman Empire. And almost exasperated, Pilate asks, what have you done? Pilate is a warrior, a soldier, a loyal servant of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. An empire which, like all empires, is founded on power and domination and self-interest. And Jesus' question allows him to explain now the difference between that sort of kingdom and his. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Jesus tells Pilate that yes, he is a king, but that poses no threat to Rome in the way that an earthly kingdom might. In fact, Jesus says that his kingdom is not based on power and domination and self-interest, but on love and humility and sacrifice. Notions with which Pilate, the warrior, would be perhaps unfamiliar. Hence, Pilate's heavily sarcastic remark, are you a king then? You? Jesus, at this point, cuts a lonely and pathetic figure, standing there in the praetorium, delivered to Pilate as a prisoner of the Jews, bound in chains. Yes, Jesus replies, for this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Pilate replies with perhaps his most famous line, what is truth? The truth didn't really feature prominently in Pilate's life. Violence, yes. Domination, force, order, yes. The empire and the interests of the empire, yes. But not truth. And it's been said that we live in a post-truth world, a world in which there's no longer any belief in universal truth, a world in which each of us has our own truth. And our own truth is in fact little more than a basket full of experiences and prejudices which we cling to for comfort as we walk around the echo chamber of our daily lives, aided and abetted by Twitter. It disconnects us from each other, and it disconnects us from God. Jesus told us he came to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. We all need to be doers of the truth. Pilate was not at all interested in the spiritual message of this poor, self-confessed alien prisoner before him. And he went back to the chief priests. I find no fault in him at all. And he throws Jesus a lifeline. Perhaps the chief priests would like Pilate to pardon Jesus, as was the custom at the Passover. And again, Pilate, unable to resist the temptation for sarcasm, says, "Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" But the gathering of chief priests and scribes shouted with one voice that a thief called Barabbas should be pardoned instead. Barabbas, who was most likely in Roman custody on death row, basically, because he was a zealot. He was an armed revolutionary, dedicated to the liberation of Judea from the Romans. To this man, Pilate offered clemency. I said earlier that the Romans didn't allow the Jews to carry out the death penalty, but it's more subtle than that. The Jews would regularly stone people to death for blasphemy or for adultery. And the multitude, remember, earlier in John, had already tried to stone Jesus to death for blasphemy on at least 2 occasions. But the chief priests didn't want Jesus to be stoned to death. They wanted him crucified. And it was the crucifixion which was the exclusive privilege of the Roman occupiers. Why did the chief priests want Jesus crucified? In fact, insisted that he was crucified. It's because crucifixion carried a curse from the living God. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 21. Anyone who is killed by hanging on a tree has a curse on him from the living God. Who was in control of events? God was. It wasn't enough for Jesus to die. The chief priests pressed for Jesus to be accursed by his own Father. The chief priests begged the Romans to carry out the crucifixion because they're not allowed to do it themselves. But back in verse 32, we see the real reason why. John tells us that this is that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. John earlier told us that Jesus said he would be lifted up. In chapter 12, John says, Jesus says, "And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself." This he said, signifying by what death he would die. Who's in charge? God is. It was God's plan from the beginning that Jesus would be accursed by his own Father, that he might become sin for us, and that through him we can be redeemed from the curse of sin. Amen.